WPSU is your source for Penn State sports, Penn State research, Penn State community. But we can't do it without your support. Make a contribution today and get a DVD of your favorite Penn State show.
I do some consulting work on American
feeling in the room was
don't ever say to her that what about the Chicago Institute?
Introductory discussion on the ethical and more of a community.
China took back over.
currently doing in autism.
He's a renowned novelist, nature writer, environmental activist, and Zen master. The New York Times Book Review calls him, quote, one of our greatest modern nature writers. Peter Matthiessen has written more than 30 books and is one of the few American writers ever to win a National Book Award for both fiction and nonfiction. He has traveled to the far reaches of South America, Asia, and Africa. This past October, he visited Penn State as a guest lecturer for the Rock Ethics Institute. We talked with him about the inspiration behind his work, his travels, and about the only adventure he's ever regretted. Here's our conversation with Peter Matthiessen. Peter Matthiessen, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
You're here at Penn State at the invitation of the Rock Ethics Institute. It's part of their lectures and ethics series, and you'll be giving a talk titled The Ethics of Environmental Activism and Social Justice. Why do you take time out of your busy schedule to come to a university like Penn State?
Well, I like to talk. I like to meet students, but also it's my livelihood. There are honorariums involved, and so it's partly that too. But also to see my stepdaughter and her kids and husband and house.
So you have family in this area?
I now have family in this area, and that's how I originally made this contact here. Now,
by your own account, you've lived a happy, privileged, even you use the word sheltered childhood, which doesn't always, is not a background that always suits a good writer. So I'm wondering what sparked what became your lifelong commitments really to four passions: the environment, wildlife, vanishing cultures, and oppressed people. What in that background led you to those passions?
I think it was the very background. I think it was the sheltered natures of it, not the wildlife and the environment. That I just, as a kid growing up in Connecticut, and I think I had the good fortune. My brother and I, we were grown up when TV was still in its very early stage. It really wasn't very interesting, and mostly black and white anyway. And so we were out of doors all the time. We lived in the back country, Connecticut, and there were a great many snakes and birds. We specialized in copperheads. We had a copperhead den right on our property. And so I think that there was that interest, and then in the summers we went to the coast and we did a lot of fishing and tide pools. And my father loved boats. We'd go offshore and fish and saw whales and sharks and stuff. So that all came built in with the life of privilege. But very early on, I became aware of this inequity of the way we lived and the way most people had to live, and it upset me. And I think that really began. I volunteered as a counselor in a charity boys camp out of New Haven when I was 13. I was only 1 year older than the kids in my cabin. And they were tough. They were kids from the turf, and there were 6 of them and 1 of me. But somehow I survived it. I'm still here. But I had just a shock. I kind of woke up. And after that time, I became more and more social activist within the terms of my existence then. And then I ran away from home. The sheltered existence, my father and I always fought like cats and dogs. And I ran off when I was 17, and I joined the Coast Guard. But he was in the Navy, and he came back from England and said,
Your father was in the Navy?
Yeah. And he said, where's Peter? My mother said, I don't know. He's hit the road. But he sort of thought I must have enlisted somewhere. And he found me, hailed me back out. I had to go back to high school, But, so I don't know. But ever since that time, and then when I was in Yale University, my favorite professor conscripted me in the CIA. As you know, he said, this is your patriotic duty. Well, my girlfriend and I, we'd met in Paris, and then we got married, and I didn't have a job. And this was offered to me. I was a greenhorn. I didn't have any politics at all. I was just a Yaley, you know. But they said, we'll send you back to Paris, because Paris was in the middle of all the ferment that happened at the beginning of the Cold War. And the CIA then was very new. It was just coming out of the OSS. And it didn't have this very ugly history of assassination and stuff that it later got into. And, but even so, and also I was writing my first novel, so I was my cover. So
working in Paris and creating the Paris Review, which is what you did in your mid-20s.
That augmented my cover, but that's how the Paris Review began. And but then, right in the middle of my first assignment, I knew I was dealing with the communists, the French communist people, and I said, these guys, they're humorless and wrong-headed, but they're honest, they're committed. I just didn't see, and we were at home the same time we were having those witch hunts, the communist witch hunts, which were awful, very ugly. And I said, I'm on the wrong side here. I got politicized, but the other way. So I finally went to my bosses and said, I'm not on your side anymore, you can't.
In fact, you said that 2 years with the CIA was the adventure, the one adventure in your life that you regretted.
It's the only adventure. My paltry career as a spy in Paris, yeah.
And during this time, your co-founder of the Paris Review, Howard Hume, he had no idea that you were undercover for the CIA.
Well, I wasn't legally permitted to tell him. I did finally. But I waited about 10 years, and then I still wasn't legally permitted, but I did anyway. I didn't think anybody would care by that time.
The interesting thing about the Paris Review is that today it's still popular and famous, but it's looking for excellent writers with no axe to grind.
Well, in a way, it was always true. We didn't ever have a political stance. I think writers in general, there are exceptions, and some good writers too who are not, but most writers tend to liberal persuasion, at least most male writers. And I think, and many have no political persuasion at all. But I've always had that. I've always been concerned with social justice, which is one reason I'm interested in giving this talk here tonight. The Rock Institute, I've just been looking over their paper on ethics and climate change. And they point to one very, very important thing, which is, well, sort of like we're having in our economy right now, which is the people who have caused all the damage are the ones who have to get off clean. And poor people all over the world are getting hammered. And that's going to happen with climate change too, inevitably. It seems to be the way we work the world.
I want to follow up on that in a minute, but what first and foremost do you see as the role or maybe even the responsibility of writers?
I think their responsibility, if they're serious, is to, in a way, go up against the establishment, to hold the establishment to some sort of ethical, honorable, moral position. I think in a way, they're almost obliged to go against the grain. I think if you have the imagination and the sensibility to be a writer in the first place, you are going to be shocked by certain social inequities and folly and lack of wisdom, which we have seen a great deal of in the last 8 years. And you remark on it. We're in a country where it's very easy to be brave. We do have protections. Some countries, if you talk against the system.
And for writers especially, many of them are jailed around the world.
Yeah, and they're in jail, a lot of these guys, or shot. So this country here, we have the liberty to speak out. Sometimes it goes wrong. I wrote one book, and my publishers and I were sued for $49 million for libel.
you're speaking in the spirit of Crazy Horse,
yeah.
and really a 695 page or so book in defense really of Leonard Peltier, who has been in prison for 32 years. You say railroaded really on bad evidence and squelched testimony.
Almost no good evidence, and all the evidence that they sent him away for 2 life terms for since that time has been shot to pieces, and the prosecutors themselves admit they never proved he was guilty. They don't know who the shooter was. There were a lot of young Indians involved in that episode.
You say the shooter, and we should say that there were 2 FBI agents killed in 1975,
yes.
And that's what he's serving his time for.
It is. Never mentioned, however, is there was a 3rd person killed that day, and that was a young Indian in the same. But he somehow isn't mentioned. Why is that? His life didn't count.
There's been an ongoing battle between you and an investigative reporter by the name of Scott Anderson in Outside Magazine.
Well,
what has that book and that debate really meant for you personally and for your career, taking on really the establishment and its treatment of Native Americans is really what's at the soul of that book?
Well, yeah, it didn't begin with this. I wrote a book called Indian Country about situations all around the country where the Indian people were being discriminated against or hurt, or their religious or spiritual places were being bulldozed or whatever. But they're having been hammered and put on this bad land to start with. They are then, people go after them, including the missionaries and the churches. They're trying to so-called acculturate them. They don't want them to have their own traditions. And I don't know why, but it just don't seem to be able to do it. So I traveled around the country with an Indian friend of mine who's kind of a spiritual guide, but he knew all the spiritual people. And I was interested in those traditions, but inevitably they would tell me about their spiritual stuff, and not willingly, and usually that doesn't come out. And then they'd say, well, we've told you what we've done. What will you do for us? What can you do? We're dying here. We're poor. We have a terrible problem with alcoholism. The land is dreadful. You can't grow anything.
Uranium contamination, among other things.
Contamination, a lot of that. And so I got interested in the political thing. And when that happened, then I heard about this man, Leonard Peltier, who was at that time in California, in a prison there, Lompoc. And I kept hearing about this guy who was not a showboat, but had become a real leader of his people in prison.
In Pennsylvania, incidentally, in Lewistown, Pennsylvania. Lewisburg.
And in fact, I was in Lewisburg a few weeks ago. I served at his parole hearing as an advocate for Peltier. I've known him now for 30 years.
Some say that he's not the martyr you paint him out to be, and you've been criticized as a bleeding heart and even as a boob for defending him. Do you feel the same today about that case?
Yes, I do. See, people get mixed up. I'm interested, and I even said it in my book, I'm interested in the fact that justice was not done here. Leonard did not get due process of law. He did not have a fair trial. Even his own judges have recommended his commutation. And when your own prosecutor admits that they never proved you were guilty, and your own judges recommend the commutation of your sentence, what does that say?
Why do you think he's still in jail? Because
I think he's still in jail because I think the FBI made a terrible mess of their investigation. 2 of the 3, there were 3 guys indicted. The first 2 were acquitted. And they were down to 1, and they just warped their entire investigation to make all the guilt fall on this guy Peltier. And they I think, cheated drastically in his trial. They warped evidence. They did not give evidence that was exculpatory. They would shoot out every single hearing by the judges for abuse of the evidence, They really were going to put that guy in. They even rigged it. They took away the original judge and put in their own judge. It was a total railroading, whether or not Leonard was the shooter. It doesn't, we are seeing a transgression of justice here. And I don't think he was, but who know? They admit they don't know, and I don't know either. And I've talked to virtually everybody who was involved. But there were a lot of young Indians there. One of them, a lot of them were shooting, but most of them, I think, were shooting over the heads of the agents. They just wanted to get them off their land. And but somebody, when the two guys were wounded, and this is a great tragedy, and the Indian people aren't proud of it either, but somebody went down there and finished them off when they were wounded, as the government says, execution style. That makes it more. And that's a great, great tragedy and very much too bad. And I agree that whoever was responsible for that has to take responsibility. But the jury, when the first two guys, Bob Robidoux and Darrell Butler, when they were acquitted, the jury foreman came forward and said, we would have acquitted these men even if we felt they'd participated in the killing, because the pressure on the Indian people on Pine Ridge, you know, they were harassed and they were poor, and the FBI.
So it was a powder keg.
It was a powder keg, and these guys, the two FBI agents, they didn't handle it well, and then they thought they had backup, and they did. They had massive backup, and so much backup that the Indians all felt, and I think correctly, that all that backup, what was it suddenly doing on the reservation? Within half an hour of the shootout, they were there. And I mean National Guard, helicopters, state police.
It escalated the situation.
No, they were there. And why were they there? And they feel they were there to wipe us out. We were an American Indian movement camp. And they were all set. They wanted to provoke an episode, which they did. But these two guys, they parked their car in the wrong place. They parked their car down in the gulch. And the other people who were coming in to help them couldn't see them. It was just so unfortunate, but the Indians didn't provoke it. So.
Throughout your 50 or more year distinguished writing career, your first love, you say, is fiction, and yet more than twice of your work has been nonfiction. Has most of that been done out of a sense of duty or responsibility to represent a cause or a people that might not otherwise get their day?
I think most of it has. Generally speaking, I do have a purpose like that. Some of them were just sort of wildlife books. But even there, I did a wildlife book about tigers and about the cranes, which are the most beautiful birds in the world. And I saw all 15 species around the world. It was wonderful. Travels. So sometimes it's for wildlife or the environment or for oppressed people, tribal people especially. That sort of guides me. And I've written more nonfiction simply because it's a better living. Fiction takes on a perfectionist. And I work and work and work on each draft. And it takes too much time. And also these things come up that make me mad or get me involved. And I write about those.
Or you get an opportunity to see a place you've wanted to see, and the price to pay is a book or a piece.
That's rare. Usually I take care of that with being a field guide for the safari company. So it isn't that. A couple of times it was that I did a book on we got the first films of the great white shark underwater. And I had a chance to go on that expedition, and then I had to sing for my supper. I had to write a book. And the second time, a couple of young English guys, they mounted this safari into the South Sulu, which is probably the most remote area in Africa. No roads and nothing. And part of it was a walking safari, which I really wanted to do. But I had to write a book out of it. And the funny thing is that those two books, because they weren't organic, they didn't feel right. They didn't come out of some urge or need to do it, except my own curiosity, something. So I never could get the feel of them. I've always thought less of them because of that. And yet I find that the African one especially, I read from. I'll probably read from it this afternoon a little bit. Because not having the feel of it, I took more pains with the prose and the observation than some of the others. It was just paradoxical, but true.
Speaking of taking pains, you just described yourself as obsessive and perfectionistic. That's really evidenced in the fact that Shadow Country really took 30 years of your life. Shadow Country, of course, won the 2008 National Book Award. 5 years for Snow Leopard, 12 years for Far Tortuga.
That's the trouble. So you don't make a living at that. I've never been a bestseller writer, ever.
Although your books have become classics. For instance,
well, I'm glad you think so.
Wilderness in America, written in the late 50s, is considered a classic today.
Yeah, yeah. Snow Leopard is, and The Tree Where Man Was Born. That was a nominee for the National Book Award, too. Yeah, they are, but none of them were ever bestsellers. I came very close to a bestseller once. My editor at Random House called me up one day and said, "Hey, you hit it. You hit the big time." And the New York Times Sunday Book Review comes out a week in advance. If you're a subscriber, you get it on Monday. You don't have to wait till the next Sunday. And of course, all the publishers get it. And he wasn't my editor actually on that book, but he saw it and he called me up and I said, "Oh, how exciting, thrilling." Yeah, because it had the whole front page of the Sunday Book Review with really a rave review. And he said they'll put that on posters, those placards, and they'll put it in every store, every window. And whether or not they read the thing, he said they'll sell a bundle of them. He said you're rich. Well, nobody ever saw that review.
And what book are you referring to?
Snow Leopard. And they never saw that review, and the reason was that on Saturday, just before the review came out, was the beginning of the 9-month New York Times strike. And by the time that 9 months was over, the bloom was off the rose, as far as the Snow Leopard went. It did win the National Book Award, too, and that certainly has kept it a kind of a steady, but it never had that, bestseller status.
You've said that your favorite book, and maybe you've changed your mind, but in terms of you were being pleased with what you wrote was Far Tortuga. Why that one?
It may be only because it was such fun to write.
You went to the Cayman Islands.
Well, it was that. I went on a turtle voyage. I was working for the New Yorker. The New Yorker assigned me. I mean, I had the idea, and they said, "Sure, do it, great." And I went on this voyage down to Nicaragua on this old turtle ship. I mean, incredible turtle ship, and I began to see things and had experiences. And when I came back to the New Yorker to Mr. Sean, I said, "Listen, I'll gladly try to repay you all my expenses and stuff like that, but I'm going to save the best stuff for my novel." And I'm just telling you that in advance. I said, "I'll give you a good piece, but the best stuff is going to." And Mr. Sean, to his great honor, I've been dealing with editors all my life who were chintzy with the money or said, "Hey, we'll tell you," very arrogant people. Mr. Sean just looked at me. He said, "Mr. Matthiessen, do what's best for your work." And he had that real, tears arced out of my eyes practically. I was so beholden to him. But anyway, I went ahead and wrote it, and I wrote it in it is experimental in a way. I use many tactics and techniques that you would more or often associate with screenplays and stuff. And at first, it infuriated some critics, just infuriated them. And others.
Your style.
The whole approach, the whole experimental approach. Others went nuts for it. It got the best reviews and the worst reviews I've ever gotten. And naturally, I think the best reviews were correct. They were.
Is a bad review, does it still sting? You have talked many times about that very first book rejection, and you can talk about it humorously today, but does a bad review still have the same bite that it did when you were a young man?
Yeah. Yes and no. Yes and no. I always try to learn from bad reviews. I see what is the matter here. Once I get past the guy's obvious defects of character. But so in a way, there's usually a good reason. Some reviews really are vicious. There's no question. The guy's really out to get you. But generally, there's an envy or an ankle biting thing in there. And sometimes a guy just hates what you've tried to do. And a lot of people genuinely, I think they were quite sincere, hated Tortuga. They made them mad. They didn't quite get it. Why is he writing this book this way? And I thought it was a whole new way of looking at fiction. And it was fun.
You've said that American writers do weak work in their later years. And you did far Tortuga when you were in your mid to late 40s.
Well, that's not later years, my dear.
No, that's what I'm saying as a young man.
That was my youth.
That's what I'm saying. And as I think about the obsessive part of you, where you write and rewrite and you say distill every word and change sentences and chapters and entire books, really, knowing when to quit seems like part of the issue. And I wonder if that is partly not wanting to let go of these characters and places that you've become so fond and attached to.
Knowing when to quit is a very, very important thing. I know I have a little signal I get. I mention it elsewhere. But since I work so much, since I rewrite so much and polish so much, I find when I come to work, if I remove more of my corrections from the day before than I keep, and I'm removing my corrections, that's my first signal. Get out of this book. You've lost your thread. You've lost your way to proceed.
What's your writing discipline? I know that you have a converted stable or child's playhouse where you write at home.
How do you find out so much about me?
Is it important for you to be in that place, or can you write anywhere? Do you write on napkins? I know you're a voracious note taker, but does the real writing have to take place in that room?
No, I can do second drafts. I can polish away from home, but the original I like to work there. It's very quiet. It's separate from the house. Has a separate phone. I don't have to deal with the goings on of the household, which are considerable, and yeah, that's the best thing. I can polish anywhere. One of my favorite places, if you can believe it, is riding in an airplane.
Why?
Well, I'm in that little space. I can't get away. People bring me food. I make a point of terrifying my seatmates coming in. I just give them a terrible. My wife calls them my frosties. I turn on my ice blue eyes, and they never bother me after that.
Are you recognized when you're on a plane?
Very occasionally. I like to boast and say that no waiter knows my name. No, not very often.
And yet tourists do make almost pilgrimages to your home in New York to see you.
Not with my encouragement. They don't. I am very I'm very private that way. Yeah, there was a guy who showed up at my office door one day with his little girl, and he'd met me at some cocktail or something in the few days before, and he didn't even say good morning. He just said, "I wanted to show my kid what a writer's studio looks like." And I said to the little girl, "Have you seen it?" And I said to him, "Get off my property." And it never came by. I ushered him right out of there. I couldn't believe it, that he had the gall to do that, that we were just on display like some kind of a raccoon in a menagerie.
And protecting your privacy, I would imagine, is more difficult in this age of the internet and of blogging.
Well, I'm very fortunate, and not very fortunate, very sensible. I'm not on the web. I only use a cell phone when I'm traveling, so I have no cell phone calls, no email. It's wonderful. I know it's very, and I still play quite a lot of tennis, and my doubles partners are very annoyed because they can notify each other, and they have to call me.
The old send the Pony Express to get Matthiessen.
Yeah, they've almost forgotten how to use a phone, let alone write a letter.
The Snow Leopard was written, I think, just a few years before or after converting to Zen Buddhism. What attracted you to that?
To Zen Buddhism?
Yes.
Well, in a word, during the 60s, my wife and I, my then wife who died, were very interested in Eastern thought. We genuinely were, and there wasn't any way to get at it. There were no teachers that we knew of in America. We wanted, and this was before I got working with American Indian teachers who I think, given everything, if I'd started that way, that's who my teachers would have been. But it's very hard to find good teachers among them too. The ones who are known are those kind of media phonies, you know, and the real people who are hidden, who are always hidden in the Indian world. They're hard. I found one, and then he died, and he died quite young. But I was going to work with this guy. Anyway, so during the 60s, we found our path became LSD and the other drugs too, the other hallucinogens. In those days, it wasn't quite the way it's become. We found a guy who was kind of a renegade shrink. He discovered that working with these drugs, he could handle 30 people where he was only working with one before. And so he had it, and at that time, LSD was all made by Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in Switzerland. So you knew exactly what you were getting. It really was a controlled substance. And of course, since that time, you don't know what you're getting. I heard the horror stories, you know, but at that time it was. And we worked with him and experimented, and we had friends in Italy, and we all did it there. It was very, very illuminating and very useful. And I felt at that time that properly administered, it would be wonderful for everybody.
Were there bad trips?
My wife had terrible trips, but she was very brave about it, and she learned a lot. She admitted she was learning. She was seeing a great deal about herself and about life. She did have some bad trips. I had a few myself, but there was no doubt in my mind that I was seeing something. But then I went over to Zen practice because, in a way, you arrive at the same perceptions and insights without the chemical interference.
And what do you think of, because Buddhism has become more and more popular in the U.S., but many say that the real essence of it, that in the U.S. people adopt just parts of it. What do you think of American-style Buddhism?
I think some of it is wonderful. Some of it's done very, very well. I think I had 3 Japanese teachers and then an American teacher, and the American teacher, he's still going strong. And I think most people would agree he's the best teacher in America. And he's even admired by the Japanese, who by and large do not admire American Zen practitioners. We're too soft, too, as you say, deterred by other aspects. So I think at its best it's very good. You're going to always, with a thing, something like that, you're going to have imitators or phonies or frauds or people who really are not committed and don't understand it very well. And the great pity is that they transmit this very poor understanding to their students. So you have a lot of nonsense out there.
What has been the most difficult thing to give up, and what have you been happiest to give up because of following Zen Buddhism?
Well, I've always said that my great aim is to simplify my life. And Zen Buddhist practice certainly enhances that. I can't claim that I've simplified my life very much. I am very intense and volatile, and I get involved in a lot of things, and I've got a short fuse about things I feel strongly about. So I still have a very complicated life with, you know, children, grandchildren, and various responsibilities. But that's what I long for, to try to. And to the degree I've been able to do it, I can thank really probably Zen practice. Growing up has helped a little bit too.
How have you balanced family and this professional life that took you to the far corners of the earth?
Well, I think my wife would say I hadn't balanced it. You know, I hadn't. She's been very, very good about supporting me in doing this, but it's been a hardship for her too. And so, and for my kids, I don't, you know, I've said it elsewhere, so I'll say it here. I think I'm a good father in the sense of being responsible and so forth, and I love my kids; they're wonderful. But I'm not a good father in the conventional way of seeing it, and a lot of that is because I've been absentee. I've been way too much, and also because I don't think artists, by and large, are good parents. You know, you're too self-involved, and the self is not just your own ego. The self is your work too. You're too caught up in that. It's very difficult to. So I've known a lot of writers and a lot of painters too, and I've known very few good parents among them.
You've said that the best writing is really a series of little astonishments. What's the last thing?
No, I can't claim that. That was E.M. Forster.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
You repeated it maybe.
I did. I have.
What was the last?
But always with attribution. Yeah.
What was the last thing that really astonished you?
Well, I think I was fishing in Montana, and I happened to know the guide who was fishing the Madison River, and there's a place called Hegpen Lake or Ennis Lake, where it empties out into a gorge, into a deep gorge, and then it comes out into the Madison again. But that section of it is called Bear Trap Canyon. Why, I don't know. And it's got a Class 5 rapid in there. And the guy, he suggested that we portage around it, and he would meet us at the bottom. He was rowing a small Zodiac canvas boat, you know. And because he said, I have flipped this boat in here. This is rough stuff. And he didn't want to have that happen. And I just had this impulse. I said, you know, I'm 82. My best work's behind me. I want to go down with you. So he said, you do it? I said, yes, I really do. And I did. And at first I was frightened. It was so scary. Like, we went up above and looked at it. I couldn't believe it. It was white water and tumbling boulders and waterfalls, everything from side to side. There wasn't any open water there. And suddenly I really meant business, and I was calm. I was scared as hell, and he was a little tense. You know, I could see that he got to get ready for that. All I had to do was be in charge of the third oar, because apparently often as you're tumbling down through the falls and stuff, you snap off one of your oars on a boulder or hits the boulder wrong. And he said, just get ready to unleash that and give it to me in a big hurry if I break an oar. And I said, sure, I can do that. But when we got to the bottom of this thing at the end of the run, we were just like two little boys. We were just grinning from ear to ear, you know. I think I was just so happy. I thought, oh, I never thought I'd have an adventure again like that. I've had a lot of them in my life, but I didn't expect one at my age. So that was my last thrill.
There's a quote, and I want to.
I hope my wife is not listening to this program, because she'd kill me if she knew I did.
There's a quote, and I can't find it this minute, but you talked about getting back from a very strenuous trip, dangerous as well, and the melancholy that you felt. You're home safe, and yet you can't shake this sad feeling that you have. Is it because of the adrenaline rush is over, or what is it?
I think it's because, you know, a moment ago we touched on living, I don't like that cliche, living in the moment, you know, it's become such a cliche. But it's true. When you're in a dangerous experience, in an episode like that, you are truly alive. You are not thinking about anything else. And in the Snow Leopard, I mentioned that too, is why people hang on to war experience. They may not want to talk about it, but they do hang on to it. And they hang on to sexual experience, the intensity of that moment, you know, like that. And I think you're sad because you know that most of your life you're not living that way. You're living in a kind of a half-baked way. You're always half here, half there. You're eating a meal while you're watching TV, or you're doing now it's called multitasking, but it isn't. It's what we call in Zen practice, we call monkey mind. You're always grabbing at things. What is the next thing? And in that kind of intense experience, it's scary. Boy, are you there. I use with my students when I'm talking to them, I said, because we have this little Zendo room, I said, what would you feel if a tiger jumped into this room? A huge tiger, and you're right there with us. How would that be? You know, kind of thing. And I point out, you would not be thinking of anything but that tiger. And that's the kind of intensity I want you to bring to your zazen, your sitting, you know.
You've said about your writing, and especially when we're talking about fiction, the plot isn't all that important, that it's the feeling, that you have either for the character or the place, and that the plot is something that you'll work out later.
Yeah, the plot, somebody said the plot is kind of the melody. It's a theme that comes back and works through and kind of holds in a way, sort of ties everything together. I mean, for example, in this last book, Shadow Country, Mr. Watson is in a sense, his story is the plot, what happens to him as a child until his neighbors kill him. But I want to know, I'm much more interested in how this happened. How does it happen that a very intelligent, able, humorous guy who's loved by his 3 wives and at least all but one of his children, got 7 kids, and admired and respected by his neighbors, and yet they kill him, and they kill him with 33 bullets. They meant business, you know. How does this thing happen in a remote rural community in Florida, you know? I don't know, the feel of that, as I mentioned often, I learned about it from my father. He showed me the Watson place. It was a real place on the Chatham River in the Everglades that comes down to the Gulf, a very wild river. It was the only house in the Everglades then, the only one. And it was 3 miles up that river. And who would live there? And this is the man that gets blown away by his neighbors when he goes up to the nearest little settlement.
Now that's the true part of the story.
That much is true. That much is true, but very little else that you could ever find, and it's all been blown out of proportion, exaggerated, and a great deal of, lying. So,
and Shadow Country is really the Watson trilogy, edited and distilled and reworked and re-rendered over really a course of 30 years into this.
Well, no, the 3 original novels, they were all published in the 90s. They all came out. The middle novel, for me, never worked, and I pillaged it for the other 2. And it just, I thought, weakened the whole thing. And
but I mean, for 30 years, you've worked on Watson. He's been a part of your psyche, really.
That's right. My first notes for it were taken about 1978. But then I thought I would pull it together in about a year and a half. That was my idea. Well, that took 6 or 7 years. I ended up rewriting practically every sentence.
Why not a Truman Capote cold blood approach as a nonfiction novel for Watson?
I don't know. It didn't strike me that way. I could have written a nonfiction book. I heard the Watson story, and all I wanted, it was just a thread that would hold all the environmental stuff and all the treatment of American Indian people in the Everglades and Florida, all of that. And this story, the Watson story, was just going to be I call it like a strangler fig. It took over the main tree and grew out of that. But the plot was of no interest, and I wanted to get it out of the way, and I blew the plot right in the very first chapter of the very first book.
We know he died. We know his neighbors.
We know his neighbors
riddled him with bullets.
Yeah, and to me that was the least interesting thing. How did this happen is what's interesting, not that it happened.
How did it happen, yeah. or why, or how are myths made? Yeah, because he certainly did become quite the legend.
Oh, he sure did. But most people don't like it. My British publisher, when he said it, he said, "What have you done? This is disastrous. You can't blow the plot in the very first." I said, "No, I said, I blow the plot, and now the book begins.
Where does the plot, where do you find it? Are you in the grocery store, or are you sleeping and you wake up and say, okay, this is what will happen? How does it come to you?
Well, basically I had the plot. Watson was a real man, and he was blown away by his neighbors in Chokoloskee. And that's the only plot. Then I started researching. I found that everything said about him in print was wrong. I began looking into the family, of course, wouldn't talk to me because you can imagine in 1910 what a scandal it was to have the pater familias blown away with 33 bullets. His son-in-law was the president of the bank, and they were a good family. They weren't trailer trash, these people.
His descendants read this book, or the 3 books, I'm imagining, the Trilogy and now Shadow Country. Have you heard from them? His Watson's
sure.
descendants.
Oh, sure. As a matter of fact, it was very touching, because in the beginning they wouldn't touch me at all. Then I heard from somebody who was a great nephew that his great aunt was one of Watson's children living away in the panhandle of Florida. And she'd gotten curious about it, and he arranged I go and see her. And that was the opening door. That was on one side, and then on the other there was a lady right there where I was, and my dad lived on Sanibel Island in Fort Myers. She was the granddaughter. Somehow leaked word to me that she wanted to talk, and gradually it began. And then at the end, they all wanted to talk, and I had a great experience of his youngest child, who'd never known him. She was only 5 months old when he was killed, but she lived up in Central Florida, and she got word through her daughter that she wanted to see me, and it was so touching. She met me with her 2 kids, and she'd read the first book, Killing Mr. Watson, which had all the dirt in it. And she said, I said, your father's not a very good guy in this. And she said, no, but he's a human being. She said, for me, he was a monster of fable and myth, and you brought him to life, and you've given me back my father, with warts and all, but, and she invited me to her 94th birthday party, and I became, very good friends with them all. Now, yeah.
Is there something in your pocket that a Watson-type character that's germinating, that's waiting to be told? Is that a once-in-a-lifetime gift?
I recognize it as, don't forget, it was a gift, because if I went only on the known facts of Edgar Watson, I'm probably dealing with an alcoholic sociopath. To make the book work, I had to make him more interesting than that. And he was interesting. He was very capable indeed. He wasn't any dope. But I made him even more interesting, so his frustration would be more. And I also made him, if I may say so, I think just to make it bearable to be in the company of this man for 30 years, I made him funny. In a black humor, laconic way, he's very funny. And that made him bearable to me. And I was saying to these kids last night in the seminar, I was thrilled when a lot of readers, and even a couple of the reviewers said, I don't know why, but when Watson dies, I was very sad. I miss him. They got to like him, warts and all, and that's exactly one of my purposes in writing that book.
And obviously you liked him. For them to like him, you had to like him.
In a way, intellectually, I thought he was appalling, but in my heart, I know, that, as we all know, we're all capable of this kind of behavior. We can't say we are this kind of person and they're that. In the end, as Goethe said, I know of no crime. I've never heard of any crime that I'm not capable of committing myself. And under the right circumstances, we can all push those buttons. And if we think we can't, that's when we get in trouble. So.
How different are the indigenous people that you've come to know from the way we view environmentalism and conservation, and how concerned are you about the planet and conservation?
I am very concerned indeed. In fact, I think last night when I was teaching this seminar, I sent them all home terribly depressed. I don't think things look good, and global warming is just the most recent thing that's coming down the highway at us. We know, look at our weather patterns now, simple as that. So I'm not going to do it and burden your listeners with that at the moment, but I'll probably touch on it again this evening. No, things are not good, and you try to, as best you can. But your question started about how do Indian people or indigenous people...
Well, what's the difference between the way indigenous peoples look at nature and the way we do?
They have a holistic view, just as the Eastern religions do. In fact, Indian people I've worked with say, what do your Zen teachers think about working with old Indians? And I said, they aren't exactly the same, but the grounding view is very, very close indeed. It's just that you are part of nature, and but that also permeates mysticism in the Christian church. I mean, that Meister Eckhart's famous thing, "The eyes with which I see God are the eyes with which God sees me." It's that oneness, and that's exactly the American Indian. And most, by the way, most traditional peoples have that. We've lost it because of our cerebral and our science, our education. We put it into categories. Everything has a name. We've lost that holistic sense. We're all become specialists and rather narrow. And that's not entirely wrong. Our society, our civilization needs that. But other people, but the environmentalists in the old days, at least, they were very sentimental about American Indian people. And I'm not, and the Indians certainly are not. They are very irreverent about their own spirituality, and they kind of laugh at us, you know. And it's true. I mean, I've known some terrible Indians, quite a few of them, as a matter of fact. They're just like human beings are like us, you know. They're good ones and bad ones, and the bad ones are bad, bad, bad.
Well, one of your disciples, I would call her in the environmental movement, is a writer by the name of Terry Tempest Williams. And
Yeah.
she wrote something that stuck out to me. The eyes of the future are looking back at us, and they are praying for us to see beyond our own time. And of course, that makes me think of Native Americans and their look to the seventh generation, not just next generation.
Yeah. It's true. It's irresponsible to spoil the land for your descendants, your children and grandchildren. How dare you? How dare you pollute all the resources, pollute the air and the water? Yeah, they're horrified by our irresponsibility in this way.
Who do you see as America's real truth tellers today? Are there any?
Yes, there are. I mean, I think there are a number of them. Some of them, they're telling truths in different ways. Wendell Berry, who's a poet in Kentucky and a farmer, and his philosophy is wonderful, very, very good indeed. Bill McKibben. There's a very good institute in Washington run by a guy called Lester Brown. I like the way they think. In the political leadership in the world is where you're getting in trouble. I mean, there are people with, I think, great vision. People like the Dalai Lama and Nelson Mandela and people like that who really put their whole being into where their mouth is. They mean it and they show it and so forth. No, there are lots of very, very dedicated people, including a lot of sort of small local environmentalists, but people who really put it on the line, who are risking their lives, who are protecting this patch of forest on a river in South America or whatever. There's a Nigerian poet called Ken Saro-Wiwa, and he fought for the welfare of his land, which was being polluted by Shell oil. This oil slicks everywhere, that all the land was being poisoned. And he stood up to that, and they threatened him, and they hung him, and with about 7 other guys, they just murdered them all. Well, that's the kind of guy that I admire. He's, you know, and they're not all executed for their bravery. But as I say, this country is a very easy country to be brave in. You can shoot off your mouth quite a lot and get away with it, you know.
What are you shooting your mouth off about next? Is there something in the works?
Yeah, there is, but I'm not sure how I'm going to approach it yet. Maybe I should just retire. I've written 30 plus books. I mean, that should be enough.
I want to end with this one last thing. You said we all must make an effort for the betterment of mankind, even though we know it won't do any good. Are you that pessimistic, or are you more by nature?
No, I meant exactly that. But that doesn't mean you can't make life better for those around you. And in fact, that maybe is somebody who said, not me, but somebody said, yes, the point of life is to make life easier for others where you can help. But in the overall, you know it's not going to be very good. A statistic I mentioned last night, which I just read recently, but civilized people in the last century alone have murdered 100 million other civilized people. That's scary. So as long as that, I mean, in other words, we are so far from being truly civilized. We are technologically way out there, and we are also a very beautiful species, as I always insist on. We are capable of the most beautiful behavior, moral standards and everything else of the kind, true kindness, true generosity. We are capable of that. I'm not saying that all human beings are Homo sapiens, but I did quote last night to Kurt Vonnegut was a friend of mine, and he gave me a sticker for my truck that says, "Your planet's immune system is trying to get rid of you." And I think that's true. We have become a curse on the planet, our species. Too bad.
Peter Matthiessen, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thanks a lot. I enjoyed it.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with literary icon Peter Matthiessen. Comcast subscribers can watch this program anytime on Penn State On Demand. Find out how at conversations.psu.edu, where you'll also find an excerpt from Mathiessen's book Shadow Country, as well as additional video clips from this interview. I'm Patty Satalia. Join us for our next Conversation from Penn State.
Production funding provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you. Thank you. This has been a production of WPSU. A copy of the program you've just seen can be purchased through Penn State Media Sales at mediasales.psu.edu or by calling 800-770-2111.